We hear in our first reading today, "Thus says the Lord, share your bread with the hungry, shelter the oppressed and homeless, clothe the naked when you see them. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn." There's an old Chinese proverb that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, and teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. There's a lot of wisdom in that proverb. Of course, the idea that it's one thing to just give something to someone to help them out, but then there's also the step of empowering them and teaching them. But when it comes to serving the poor, while this is applicable in some cases, the question arises, or it becomes a tough question, when what about those who are still learning how to fish? Or what about those who aren't capable of learning how to fish? Or what about those who just stubbornly refuse to learn how to fish because it's easier just to get a fish from someone else? Well, what do we do with them when it comes to serving the poor? That's where the questions get tougher. Well, we can't let them starve. So that's one of the things. We still have this call to serve the poor. And there will probably always be some, when it ever comes to this question of serving the poor, as Christ calls us, there's always going to be some who are still in learning, who are incapable of learning, or who refuse to learn. And that might be part of what Jesus meant when he said, "The poor you will always have with you." But there becomes that fine line between enabling someone continuing their bad behaviors and empowering them for something more. And of course, there's a lot of discernment. We have to be responsible and prudent. And sometimes tough love comes into play. But I think in all this, that's where when it comes to serving the poor, it takes a lot more of personal investment, accompaniment, and ultimately relationship. Because for us as Christians, it's not merely about solving the problem of poverty so much as loving the poor. It's not as much about solving the problem of poverty as much as it is about loving the poor. And what I mean by that is that it's not merely about this abstract problem, but it's about walking with people. Moving from problems to people. Yes, certainly we should do all we can to solve the problem of poverty. Absolutely, we're called to do that. To root out systemic injustices and so on and so forth, social injustices that exist in the world. But at the end of the day, our call as Christians is always to something more. That it's about walking with people. And I think at the end of the day, poverty is more likely to be solved by personal accompaniment than by politics. There's a man by the name of Peter Morin, who's known for starting a movement with a woman named Dorothy Day in the early 1900s. I think I mentioned her last week. They started the Catholic Worker Movement together. That was all about, from their Catholic faith, that they lived with, among, and served the poor. And Peter Morin wrote this little essay. He wrote, "In the first centuries of Christianity, the poor were fed, clothed, and sheltered at a personal sacrifice. And the pagans said about the Christians, 'See how they love each other.' Today, the poor are fed, clothed, and sheltered by the politicians at the expense of the taxpayers. And because the poor are no longer fed, clothed, and sheltered at a personal sacrifice, but at the expense of taxpayers, pagans say about Christians, 'See how they pass the buck.'" Peter Morin and Dorothy Day, in their service of the poor, they were more than just about serving the poor, but they wanted to transform, create a new culture. transform minds and hearts of people into this mission of serving the poor. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there's not times when you use government money or cooperate with government money in sharing this, and certainly taxpayer dollars and government agencies may have a role in our service of the poor. But what I am saying, though, is that we as Christians, being called by Christ to be the light of the world, have a particular call and duty to this serving of the poor and this accompaniment of the poor. Both as individuals, that we have to discern and pray about how are we called as individuals in this mission, serving the poor. How are we called to love the poor, to walk with them, to accompany them? And maybe what is the mission of the poor we're called to financially support? But of course, we also have our own responsibilities, various obligations in life. Sometimes we're limited in how much we can do that as individuals. But that's why we're also called to be a part of church. That it's not just a me and Jesus thing, but it's a we and Jesus thing. How do we, as being a part of this mission of the church, accompany the poor? That maybe we as an individual can't directly walk with this poor person, but we can support a mission in some way that does. So there's also this communal dimension. How do we as a community of believers serve this mission, walk with people, accompany them? And yes, of the global dimensions, the global church, how do we support that mission of people who are poor all over the world? But also more locally, how do we as church, as the Church of the Archdiocese of Dubuque, serve the poor? Through Catholic Charities. But also, on a more local level, how do we as the church of Franklin and Hardin counties serve, accompany, love, walk with the poor among us? How do we, as a church, how are we called to do that right here in Iowa Falls? And that may look very different in different places. How are we called to live and do that? We've been having the conversation, I know everyone's been asking, about the house that we have behind here. Which conversations have been going about that, and before the end of the month, we will have a presentation that will talk more about that. But asking that question of how can we use everything we're blessed with to serving the poor? And yes, we have to be responsible in investing and good stewards of what we have. But I am a firm believer that if we invest in this mission of the poor, God does bless us in that mission. There's the old English carol that you often hear around Christmas time, Good King Wenceslas, which some of you may be familiar with. You hear on the radio around Christmas time, because it's about St. Wenceslas, who the day after Christmas, him and his servant went out, saw a poor man wandering around in the snow. They went out to him and brought him food. And if you're not familiar with this song, well, I'll sing it to you afterwards. But many times when we hear the song on the radio, we only get the first few verses. And we don't always make it to the last verse of the song, which is telling you what the whole point of the song is. Which is to learn a lesson from good King St. Wenceslas. And here's the last verse of the song. It says, "Therefore, Christian men be sure, wealth or rank possessing, ye who now will bless the poor, shall yourselves find blessing." And so last week, we talked about sharing in the light of Christ. Being with Christ, a sign of contradiction and a light to the world. Especially in intentional community. And so this week, building on that, the question of how are we called to be light to the world, especially in the mode of intentional accompaniment, walking with others in their journey of life. You are the light of the world, says the Lord. You must let your light shine before others, that that they may see your good deeds and glorify your heavenly Father.